It is Thursday, the 7th of May, 2020, and I'm looking at the Facebook page of UUA President Reverend Susan Frederick-Gray, and I'm looking at basically something she posted yesterday. It says, I recently had the pleasure to share my thoughts about the integrity of community for the Church of the Larger Fellowship, the wonderful program Quest for Meaning. I hope you'll read it and consider sharing a link or a subscription with someone you love who could benefit getting access to insightful, values-based online content that helps us all explore the big questions of life. And as we can see, there's a link to the Quest for Meaning article, The Integrity of Community, Quest for Meaning. A little note of thanks from the Church of the Larger Fellowship. Thank you, Reverend Susan. We are so grateful for your words. Well, let's see what those words are, because I don't think the UUA has very much integrity at all. Okay, so the integrity of community, quest for meaning. I see there's an audio file here. Let's see what it says here. Integrity is one of the most important character traits we develop, or we can develop. It is important because it requires both clarity about what we value most and the ability to be reflective about our actions and our lives. But what about communities? What about congregations, denominations, governments, and societies? Just as for an individual, integrity in community is a measure of the alignment between what a community, organization, or society says about what it values and its actions, intentions, behaviors, and policies. So I may not have pronounced that quite as well as I could have, so let's do it one more time. Just as for an individual, integrity in community is a measure of the alignment between what a community, organization, or society says about what it values and its actions, intentions, behaviors, and policies. So a lack of integrity would be when a group's actions and practices violate or negate who they say they are. Well, guess what? The Unitarian Universalist Association, which represents the Unitarian Universalist religion, not only in terms of North America, but I would say internationally. There are other Unitarian organizations, but the UUA, the Unitarian Universalist Association, essentially is the primary representative of Unitarian Universalism in the whole world. It could be thought of as the Vatican of the Unitarian Universalist religion. It's the corporate headquarters, if you wish, of Unitarian Universalism. Well, guess what? The UUA has an incredible dearth of integrity. It does things that are completely in violation of the claimed principles and purposes of Unitarian Universalism. It betrays centuries-old traditions of Unitarian and Universalism at the drop of a hat. And what's worse is that when it's called out, when the UUA is called out about its lack of integrity, excuse me for saying so, it refuses to bring itself back into integrity by correcting the problem. Let's continue. Blah, 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 blah. Integrity requires not only clarity about which values matter most, but also the ability to reflect on our actions and to gauge their alignment with those values. There seems to be so little capacity in our public discourse for this kind of reflection and debate, and this fosters disillusionment, regardless of political persuasion, with government and public officials because of their inability to act for the public good or address questions that matter most. Well, this is interesting in how she aligns it with the political and leaves out the religious. She's basically switching things over to how politicians lack integrity and just totally disregarding how Unitarian Universalist ministers and UUA leaders lack integrity. I can assure you that they also don't have much of an ability to reflect on their actions or gauge their alignment with Unitarian Universalist values. I've given Reverend Susan Frederick-Gray and numerous other UUA leaders, plenty of opportunity to reflect on the actions of the UUA and to gauge the alignment of those actions with the claimed values of Unitarian Universalism. They haven't done so. There's definitely very little capacity in Unitarian Universalism's public discourse for this kind of reflection and debate. I can tell you that. In fact, they do everything they can to silence you if you try to raise issues about integrity and lack of integrity and so on and so forth. And I would say that does foster disillusionment in many people in terms of disillusionment with Unitarian Universalism, not just government and public officials. And in a sense, public officials, obviously this is speaking in terms of politics, but it would be fair to say that top-level UUA leaders such as Reverend Susan Frederick-Gray are essentially public officials for Unitarian Universalism. And unfortunately, yes, they do have an inability to act for the public good or to address questions that matter most. So let's continue. Liberty, democracy, equality, and a commitment for the common good. These are values we are saying are foundational to the U.S., and yet it is another value that has been slowly reshaping our society. Sandel argues that market values have pervaded almost all areas of our lives in society. Almost everything in the U.S. is now for sale. Well, she's bringing it to the political. But much of that could be applied to Unitarian Universalism. They basically, I'd say that they don't practice integrity if they think it'll hurt the bottom line, essentially, is what it comes down to. Let's see here. Okay, so it's going on and on about market values taking precedence over moral values, shall we say, but there's plenty of that at the UUA. There's certainly a dearth of moral values at the UUA. They lack an incredible amount of integrity, do some incredibly stupid and not only unethical and immoral things, but things that are bordering on criminality, if not actually criminal. Let's see here. Okay, they're talking about blood donations. They're making a comparison. We'll skip over that. The less we are needed or asked to be civic-minded, the less we are called on for civic duty, the less we as citizenry are aware, prepared, practice, or attentive to those needs. Wow. I alone have repeatedly asked the UUA to be civic-minded, not to mention Reverend Susan Frederick-Gray herself. Just in the last few months, I've left several phone messages and also sent some emails to Reverend Susan Frederick-Gray asking her to be civic-minded about Unitarian Universalism's clergy abuse problem, and she has remained totally silent and thus totally complicit in all of the issues that I've brought to her attention, which display a gross lack of integrity on the part of the UUA, and quite frankly, because she's not doing anything about it, it's a gross lack of integrity on the part of Reverend Susan Frederick-Gray. So let's see here. We need more civic places and opportunities for dynamic civil discourse and debate about when market values make sense and when a different set of values like democracy, equality, liberty, happiness, and justice, that's Freudian slip there, and notions of the common good need to guide us. Without this work, we will continue to drift away from our core values and struggle even more to articulate them meaningfully. No kidding. The UUA has repeatedly, quite continuously, drifted away from the claimed core values of Unitarian Universalism, especially in the area of clergy misconduct matters, and has certainly struggled to articulate them meaningfully. It's done some incredibly insane things when it comes to dealing with clergy misconduct, the exact opposite of clearly and meaningfully articulating Unitarian Universalist values. The more nearly all aspects of our lives become market decisions rather than moral ones, the weaker our ability to define and align to what's most important becomes. Okay, so I didn't read that very fluidly. Let's try again. The more nearly all aspects of our lives become market decisions rather than moral ones, the weaker our ability to define and align to what's most important becomes. Maybe she didn't write it so well either. But the point's there. And I would say, when it comes to the cover-up and denial of clergy abuse, which the UUA continues to do, that's a market decision, let's face it. That's basically, we're going to cover up and hide clergy abuse because we don't want people to have second thoughts about coming to a Unitarian church. It's the money. So they put market decisions in front of moral decisions. They basically, do not practice good moral values because they value the money more than the morality. This is why integrity is so important for the individual and for communities. Communities have the power to bring out the best and the worst in people. Change is possible. Healthy, robust, values-based conversations can be reclaimed if we start inviting them, both engaging in them ourselves and requiring them of people who ask to lead us. Well, that's interesting because I have been asking Reverend Susan Frederick-Gray and other top-level UUA leaders, to say nothing of other Unitarian Universalist ministers and so on, to engage in some healthy, robust, value-based conversations with me about Unitarian Universalism's clergy abuse problem, to say nothing of some other problems within Unitarian Universalism, such as the anti-religious intolerance and bigotry of the atheist. Well, not the whole atheist faction, but there's a subset of Unitarian Universalist atheists who are quite anti-religious, intolerant, bigoted towards God-believing people in general, and Christians in particular. And that may not be as bad as it was, let's say, 10 or 20 years ago, but there's still evidence that it's there, including some recent examples I've seen. That's another issue that needs to be discussed. But the whole clergy abuse issue, they refuse to enter into conversation with me about it, in spite of being repeatedly invited to do so. When we have lost our way as communities, individuals must work and speak and act to lead the community back to integrity. Well, that's interesting because that's what I've been doing. I've been trying. I've certainly been working and speaking and acting to try to lead the Unitarian Universalist community back to integrity, but it stubbornly resists my efforts. So this is basically what I see as some basically hypocrisy on the part of Reverend Susan Frederick-Gray. She says all this really nice stuff about integrity and living up to values and practicing moral and ethical values, and yet she herself fails miserably, refuses to do the things that she's talking about here. She refuses to enter into any kind of communication with me to try to resolve serious problems. And as far as doing things, not independently, but separately from me, I don't see a lot really going on in terms of addressing Unitarian Universalist clergy abuse problem. There's been some token changes from what I've seen in terms of policies. The UUMA, that is the Unitarian Universalist Ministers Association, are proposing some changes to their guidelines that may or may not be adopted this year. If they are adopted, they will actually finally, after more than a decade after I told them what they needed to do, they're actually doing some of the things that I said they should do 10 years ago, and I could have told them 15 or 20 years ago. But essentially, the Unitarian Universalist Ministers Association will be voting on whether or not to modify their guidelines, I believe, at the upcoming UUAGA this year. And if they do adopt the revised guidelines, they will adopt some changes that I suggested more than a decade ago. They were certainly well aware of even longer ago. So they're very, very slow to do anything. And there's no guarantee that they will vote in favor of the changes. They may vote them down. They may, and even another point that I'd like to make is that even if they vote these changes into, reality, reality is maybe not a good word, officiality, even if they make these things official on paper, in terms of actually practicing them, that's another story altogether. There's a huge lack of political will in the Unitarian Universalist religious community to deal responsibly with clergy misconduct. As flawed as they are, the existing policies and procedures could have been used to provide a modicum of justice to numerous victims of clergy misconduct of all kinds, sexual or non-sexual. And yet, they always find ways of brushing aside the complaints, rejecting the complaints, ignoring the complaints, silencing people, and it's extremely rare that a Unitarian Universalist minister faces any kind of accountability, and when they do face some accountability, it's pretty minimal compared to the severity of the offense. So even if the policies and procedures are perfect on paper, that's no guarantee that they will actually be responsibly acted upon. So I'm making a video of this. I think I will bring this to the attention of Reverend Susan Frederick-Gray. Let's just scroll back up to the audio file here. Let's see how it sounds.
The Integrity of Community by Reverend Susan Frederick-Gray, President, Unitarian Universalist Association. Integrity is one of the most important character traits we can develop. It is important because it requires both